So I'd like to remind us again of the fundamental goal, which is to manage this beautiful area that we all care about, the Sargasso Sea. And throughout the day, as Caroline just mentioned, each group will be discussing the restrictions that we propose should be implemented and in each of our designated areas. In this presentation, we will discuss some of the governance mechanisms and bodies that will help us regulate and enforce these regulations within selected areas. Okay.
So, this is the Sargasso Sea, and as you can see, it's very mesmerizing, and we had the immense opportunity of experiencing and looking at its beauty, and because of it, we have a strong belief that we have to protect it. So, in order to explain it, I want to show you more about where the Sargasso Sea is found. The Sargasso Sea is found in an area beyond national jurisdiction, which is the line in the red line, and the only country that's found in it is Bermuda. Now, the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea created maritime boundaries in order to better explain where a country and an area is organized. This is set up by the territorial sea at first, and then we have the exclusive economic zone, which is right there. And it goes from 12 nautical miles to 200 nautical miles. This is an area where a country or nation has the sovereignty and the rights to explore, exploit, and manage natural resources, but also has the jurisdiction to protect these. Then we have the area beyond national jurisdiction, where we sailed and we're very interested in because of the Sargasso Sea. This contains the high seas and the area. The high seas is made of the water column, while the area is made of the seafloor. Here, no nation has the right nor the jurisdiction over it, but it is open to many nations to use it for fishing and for shipping and anything else. However, areas beyond national jurisdiction have many challenges in being managed. One of these has to do with the fact that it is open access to many nations, and because of it, there is little management on human activity. Now, the other one has to do with the fact that there is no global legally binding framework. This means that there is no set of laws or a specific global process to implement and enforce management in areas beyond national jurisdiction. Now, the other thing is too, the fact that, we know there's many nations and international organizations that are interested in managing these areas. There is little cooperation among these. And this means that they cannot come to an agreement on how to regulate and manage areas beyond national jurisdiction based on an international legal framework. Now, having these two, lack of global legal binding framework and a lack of cooperation nation, leads to the fact that they cannot create a central governmental body that is dedicated to implement and enforce a legal regime that can regulate and manage areas beyond national jurisdiction, such as the Sargasso Sea.
So as Mareike just mentioned, there are a lot of difficulties with managing areas beyond national jurisdiction. And one of these difficulties is that there's such a fragmented governance structure in place right now for areas like the Sargasso Sea that lie outside of national jurisdictional boundaries. As you can see from this diagram, there are a lot of different entities, as well as international treaties, governments, international agreements that have some sort of regulatory power in the Sargasso Sea and play a role in the governance of the Sargasso Sea. However, the framework is very fragmented. So I'm going to speak about the three main international treaties that pertain to the conservation and management of high seas areas and areas beyond national jurisdiction. The first of these is the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. And as Mareike mentioned, this is the basis of all maritime law, and it defines maritime boundaries. As Mareike was talking about, we have the exclusive economic zones, and then beyond that, the areas beyond national jurisdiction and the high seas. What this convention does is it sets in place a series of rights and responsibilities for high seas areas. These rights include the freedom of overflight, the freedom of navigation, and the freedom of fishing, among other rights. However, this convention also stipulates that it mandates that countries cooperate on an international level to manage the resources in these high seas areas. However, this convention doesn't put into place a legal framework for this international cooperation. It also codifies the freedom of the seas doctrine, meaning that nations have a right to these open access areas, and they can come in and take the resources from areas like the Sargasso Sea with very little regulations. Next, we have the UN Convention on Biological Diversity, and this convention has 3 main goals. These are the conservation of biological diversity, the sustainable use of the components of biodiversity, and the fair and equitable sharing of the benefits derived from genetic resources. So, since this convention, these goals apply to all ecosystems. These goals apply to the Sargasso Sea as a high seas area. So it is important to conserve the biological diversity and the components of biodiversity. Additionally, this convention, with specific regards to the Sargasso Sea, sets in place a series of criteria for defining ecologically and biologically significant areas, also known as EBSAs. And the Sargasso Sea is defined as an ecologically and biologically significant area. This means that it's recognized on an international level as an area which we should think about conserving and protecting. However, this convention doesn't put into place a framework for establishing any sort of management plan once this designation has been made. Finally, we've come to the UN Fish Stocks Agreement, which specifically pertains to commercially valuable species, and it calls for the conservation and management of highly migratory or straddling fish stocks. In this case, straddling means that these fish stocks overlap multiple countries' exclusive economic zones. This agreement mandates international cooperation to conserve and manage these highly migratory or straddling fish stocks. And this mostly happens through regional fisheries management organizations. These organizations are going to be discussed in more detail later by the fisheries group. However, I'm going to mention them briefly because they are very important in the Sargasso Sea. And these regional fisheries management organizations come about through separate treaties, and they focus on a specific area, and they also often focus on a specific species or group of species in that area. These regional fisheries management organizations are in charge of monitoring the populations of these fish stocks and setting catch limits. And they're supposed to use what's called the precautionary approach, meaning they use the most conservative scientific values to estimate these population abundances and set catch limits accordingly. In addition to these international treaties, there are also international organizations under the United Nations that play a role in the governance of the Sargasso Sea. I'm going to mention them here briefly, however, they will be discussed in much further detail later on by other groups.
Now, Caroline has mentioned many of the agreements and governing mechanisms in the Sargasso Sea. But the only agreement currently in existence to address the international collaboration for conservation in the Sargasso Sea is the Hamilton Declaration. The Hamilton Declaration is a non-binding agreement signed in 2014 by 5 countries: the USA, Bermuda, Monaco, UK, and the Azores. And this acts as a framework for voluntary collaboration through the Sargasso Sea Commission. The Sargasso Sea Commission and the Hamilton Declaration were established through the leadership of the Bermudan government. But that's not all the Bermudan government has done for conservation. They've also created acts such as the Fisheries Act of 1972, the Coral Reef Preserves Act of 1996, and the Protected Species Act of 2003. More recently, non-governmental groups in Bermuda have been working for conservation as well, including 2 projects, the Blue Halo Project and a Marine Spatial Plan. The Blue Halo Project is currently a proposal to create the largest marine protected area in the North Atlantic. This would create a marine protected area from 50 nautical miles to Bermuda's EEZ 200 nautical miles out. It would designate areas as no-take zones and for other purposes. The other project that is currently in place is within Bermuda's territorial waters, here in red. And that project is currently in its planning process. It would designate areas for human uses and for conservation alike. But in addition to Bermuda, there are many other nations and entities that hold stock in the Sargasso Sea. Sabrina will introduce those now.
So as we just heard from Hannah, Bermuda obviously holds a huge stake in the Sargasso Sea as being the only nation that has any borders in the sea. Now, when we're talking about these entities that care about a certain area, we define them as stakeholders. And they can be really much anyone. It can be any government, any entity, any UN agency, any corporation, but importantly, they're people. Anyone who has ever eaten tuna is a stakeholder in the Sargasso Sea. The students of this program that sailed through the Sargasso Sea are stakeholders. And it's a really overall encompassing definition, but it's important to know that we are all stakeholders. If you've ever been to the beach, if you've ever enjoyed anything having to do with the ocean, you need to care about the conservation and preservation of these areas. Now, stakeholders are important because they have pertinent knowledge. They tend to have a better understanding of the complexity of the ecosystem of interest, the human influences on that system, and any current areas of conflict. Their involvement early and often in the management policy-making process is important because of their invaluable information and how it creates mutual understanding and ensures the longevity of resources that we're interested in managing. Most importantly, stakeholder involvement builds buy-in and a constituency for lasting success. Studies have shown that stakeholders are more likely to support a resulting management policy after being included in and having participated in a democratic process. Now, how do we figure out who these stakeholders are? It's a process known as stakeholder analysis, and just simply it's an approach to understand a system by identifying the key players and their respective needs in an area. We use stakeholder analysis to consider the needs of many stakeholders in our marine management proposal. And these are just some of the main groups that we defined as stakeholders. And as we learned from Hannah, Bermuda's government is a large player in the Sargasso Sea. Their economy, especially their tourism and fishing industries, really highly rely on the preservation and the conservation of the Sargasso Sea. But importantly, it's also their general public. The general public of Bermuda cares about their home and they care about the surrounding waters. And they are responsible for determining what kinds of local legislation get passed, such as the Bermuda Blue Halo project that Hannah just spoke about. We also have the international fisheries and international shipping interests, which I will mention here briefly, but will be very much discussed later on. Mexico, Japan, and the US are the largest fishing nations in the Sargasso Sea. But it's not just about nations. It's the fishermen that are working hard to catch these fish. It's the companies that run the boats. It's the individuals running the fish markets and chefs in restaurants ordering fish and the consumers eating fish. We all have a stake in the Sargasso Sea. And for the international shipping community, there are thousands of ships traversing through the Sargasso Sea. The North Atlantic is the busiest shipping area in the entire global ocean. We have cargo ships, cruise ships, military vessels, and everyday recreational boaters using the Sargasso Sea. Shipping companies, again, it's large companies, but it's also the crew of these ships, and it's the people that rely on shipped goods, especially Bermuda as a small island nation. They highly depend on shipping for their goods and services. Additionally, I'm really driving home the point of everyday people. It's the day sailors and the hobby fishermen and the snorkelers, the scuba divers, the charters that are taking these boats out and enjoying the Sargasso Sea. We also have the international scientific community. Bermuda sits in the center of an oceanic gyre, basically in the center of a large whirlpool of currents, and it creates a lot of really unique oceanographic phenomena, and this draws scientists from all around the world to the area. There are plenty of studies on sargassum and the sargassum community, and there's always new species to discover, and there's always oceanic processes to better understand. And of course, provides great educational opportunities, such as from here at SEA, along with the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, to take young scientists out and to bring up the next generation of scientists. And lastly, there are a lot of international organizations that hold stock in the Sargasso Sea. I've listed just a few of them here, and they will be explained in later presentations. But we have the Northwest Atlantic Fisheries Organization that is responsible for the for non-tuna-like fisheries. We have the International Commission for the Conservation of Atlantic Tunas, which are responsible for tuna and tuna-like fisheries, the International Maritime Organization in charge of shipping regulations, and the International Seabed Authority, which monitors any exploration and any activity having to do with the seabed. Now, we want to bring it back home, and I really want to take away the point that there are to make you realize just how many entities care about the Sargasso Sea. While we were in our debating process, we took all of these stakeholders and their interests into consideration when determining our areas of management shown here. To remind you, we have 2 areas of seamounts, a couple areas designated for research, along with the Western Management Area. In addition to that, we have general recommendations for the waters of Bermuda.
So as Sabrina mentioned, we have general recommendations for Bermuda, but also for governance for each of these areas. Somewhere. Well, not important. We have long-term goals, and we realized that our long-term goal, which would be to create a regional ocean management organization under the United Nations, would need many steps to get there. We propose that we need to increase collaboration among the Hamilton Declaration signatories, those 5 countries that I mentioned earlier, the UK, USA, the Azores, Bermuda, and Monaco. We might need to create a legally binding agreement from the Hamilton Declaration, something that would help these signatories come together and really look at the conservation of the Sargasso Sea in a more serious manner. We propose that the Sargasso Sea Commission take a lead role in having a greater power in their government to go forward with these conservation goals, and that more nations can join on into the Sargasso Sea Commission and eventually propose a regional ocean management organization to the United Nations. But to get here, we need education, and we need to promote the Sargasso Sea. So we'd like to look to those stakeholders, including the Sargasso Sea Commission as our leader, the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, Bermuda Institute of Ocean Sciences, Sea Education Association, and those are just to name a few. That concludes our presentation. Thank you.
Now we have about 5 minutes for questions. Yes,
Wonderful presentation, and I'm wondering if you guys are going to be available to hire yourselves out. Really very well done, and you covered all the bases so clearly, so thank you for that. I just have a question about the involvement of Monaco. It seems like an unlikely stakeholder, and maybe some of the people that aren't familiar with international goings-on and the extent to which Monaco has been involved in marine conservation worldwide might want to know why Monaco is there among those stations. You know,
So I'm not going to lie, don't know a whole lot. What we do know is that they signed the Hamilton Declaration. They are signatories, so they have put themselves out there as a nation that is concerned with and is working towards the conservation of the Sargasso Sea. In terms of international cooperation, I don't know too much about it, unfortunately. But they have put themselves out there as looking to, they've expressed interest. So I hope that somewhat answers your question.
it's very important.
Pardon? Oh. What? I'm sorry, I just don't know.
So a little background on Monaco. They were one of the key figures in setting up the Pelagos Marine Sanctuary in the Mediterranean, which was a collaborative marine protected area between Pelagos, France, and Italy. Correct. Yeah, and it was focusing on protection of cetaceans with whales and dolphins. So they're in the international realm. They've spoken up as a key leader in ocean conservation.
I didn't mean to put you on the spot.
It's
important for people who aren't aware of what's going on internationally that sometimes a country is a stakeholder without really apparent vested interests. Like Monaco doesn't have an industry in the Sargasso Sea. They are,
as someone who's not familiar with marine management, I was curious with your criteria that you picked areas that had high shipping and high fishing. As sort of a naive person, it would seem it's easier to pick somewhere to start that is not highly impacted so you don't have to deal with so many problems.
Well, we'd like to take into consideration the human uses at beach areas and the conflicts that come out, not just between people and the environment, but the different users. So the fishermen and the shipping industry are both using the same area. And if we can look at all of those needs, then we can choose management. So it doesn't necessarily have to do with the ecology all the time, but it can have a broader impact on all of it. And as you saw, we've also chosen to have research areas because we want to know those impacts and better understand how we can manage it to have better cooperation.
Thank you.
One of you mentioned the Blue Halo project, and if I got this right, they're proposing that the EEZ for Bermuda be a no-take zone.
Yes.
How could that work?
I will clarify. It's not the entire Blue Halo. It's not the entire EEZ. They do have fishermen that use or the fish within their waters. So they've selected, and please understand, this is only in its proposal project or process. Still a proposal. But it's from 50 nautical miles out to 200 nautical miles. Within that marine protected area, they can do something more spatial planning to split it up and have no-take zones within that area. It's something that's still being discussed.
It was proposed as a no-take zone, and they got some feedback on that. So there were discussions.
Very polite.
Yes, there were discussions regarding the no-take zone. So as Hannah said, they are now planning on divvying it up. But it was proposed entirely as a no-take zone, which is quite radical.
Also, in addition to that, they actually talked to a lot of fishermen in Bermuda, which turns out there aren't that many, and they found that they really weren't using beyond the 50 nautical miles. So even though these fishermen did want the opportunity beyond that 50 nautical miles, they really, at this current moment, they're not using it. And so they thought that that was an acceptable limit.
Great.
I want to compliment you as well about your ability to characterize the diversity of interests that impinge on the future of the Sargasso Sea. But I want to come back to your last set of steps to get to that new regional management plan. The very first step is to get more collaborators. Do you have any ideas of what's going to help engage other entities that were thinking about signing the Hamilton Declaration but didn't? And what do you think are some of the things that are going to help motivate people to want to join the group towards working towards ultimately their ultimate benefit in seeing the Sargasso Sea be conserved? Do you have any ideas in discussion of what's going to help everybody, but more specifically help Bermuda have more of a secure future because we can get more collaborators? Do you have any ideas on that very first step, getting people involved in this process?
Yeah, I think the first step is what we talked about at the end, the education and outreach with all the stakeholders who do have an interest in the Sargasso Sea. With that education and outreach, a lot of us really didn't even know what the Sargasso Sea was before we came here. So it's really important to get the word out there. And I think the more that people know about it, the more that people know how important it is, the more that people will take seriously these conservation efforts, and then we can get more nations on board.
Yeah, we have time for just one more question. Sorry.
Oh.
You don't have to fight it out.
Let our policy walk through it.
So I'm actually curious, you were talking about within Bermuda, there aren't a lot of commercial fishing operations going on. Are there,
50 or 60?
okay. So are there many foreign flag vessels within Bermuda waters?
Zero.
Okay. And then outside the EEZ, within the Sargasso Sea region, you've been able to sort of identify what nations have fishing vessels in those waters?
It's mostly Japan and the U.S. We will hear a lot more about specifics of fishing in the fisheries presentation later today, but the largest fishing presence outside, right, straddling the EEZs are Japan and Mexico and the United States.
And last question before we
I just want to make a statement. When can you come and present this to the commission?
I mean, anytime you want to take us to Bermuda. I'm there.
Well, I do want to say that, and Robbie touched on it, that we anticipated no signatories at the gathering. Things change, and we expect to get them back. But we're also out there looking for other signatories all the time, and we're having others come forward. So it's a growing effort, and it's not just going to stop with the 5. And we are getting a lot of interest from different countries. I won't name them at this point. But so I just think getting this word out and the thing that you all have done is really exciting. One question embedded here. Did you look much at the cable industry?
We did not.
We not exist.
We recognized it. We just, in the process of breaking up the groups and trying to determine the largest players, it's just the way kind of that our process took us down. But we do recognize it, and along with like seabed mining, there are a number of recommendations that we refer to that are overarching that we couldn't quite get the specifics on.
But I think the time we'll talk during a break. We'll talk about the cable industry and what I learned yesterday about seabed mining.
Wow. Yes,
Thank you.
Thank you to our governance group.